how's it going? I wanted to talk today about forgiveness. How do we forgive ourselves and forgive others? Okay. So, with that being said, oftentimes as we grow in life, okay, as we develop, if we're talking about youth, as our brain develops, we see things from a different perspective unless we've been feeding a particular belief system. So what I mean is as we gain new skills that often come with just the process of maturing, okay, we can have more of an analytical look on something or gain more insight and grow as a human being. However, things like trauma can stunt that growth, which is why they say, when you're triggered emotionally with trauma, oftentimes your reactionary behavior is going to mirror whatever age you were traumatized regarding that trauma, that particular trauma, because some people are traumatized multiple times in their life at different stages, different ages. But when you're working on healing that, it helps if you're working with a professional or something, that at every different developmental stage, you're able to kind of revisit it and reframe it. Because otherwise, what ends up happening is as we get older and say our brain is fully developed, usually sometime in our mid-20s, and we've been feeding a belief system, we may have now the ability to look at things a little differently. But if we've been feeding the same belief system for many years, we're going to run on that automatic belief system, therefore automatic thoughts, automatic behaviors, typically. Okay. So here's the thing. Most of us are not mindful 24/7. I've talked about this in past videos. The majority of people are somewhere between 12 and 20% of mindfulness, which means being able to be aware in the moment, present, and make informed, intentional, and discerning actions, okay, or thinking. All right. So typically we're on automatic pilot, probably about 80% of the time. Again, this is going to vary, so I don't want you to overgeneralize. It really depends on the person, but that's the typical average or whatever. And what I mean by automatic pilot, you've probably heard me say before that our beliefs create our perceptions, right? So our beliefs are the filter in which we navigate our life through. So if we're in automatic pilot and we're not being mindful, we may find ourselves being reactionary and engaging in a behavior that is automatic for us, or reacting verbally, or, whatever our triggered response is. Okay. Now, just because, and if you've ever seen my behavior chain video, just because we're triggered emotionally, the response is a little bit down the road, but it can seem as immediate as that, okay? So when we learn to kind of pull our power back and we look at it in stages and recognize when we're being triggered, if we take a pause, this is key. In like CBT, it's called thought stopping, right? Imagine a red light or a stop sign or something, and pause before you respond. We're not necessarily responsible for that initial trigger, right? But what we do with it, we're responsible for. So if we get triggered and then we don't pause and we go right into an automatic behavior that may hurt somebody in some way, that's our responsibility. So doing this helps us from re-traumatizing ourselves and others by taking that pause, by taking that moment to sit with our metacognitions, right? To sit with what is happening right now in my body, what is happening in my emotions, and what are other choices I can make besides the automatic repetitive response. Now, keep in mind, I've said this again before, the brain likes repetition. That's its comfort zone. So breaking these cycles and these ways of showing up can be difficult. And chances are we're not going to get it right 100% of the time when we get started. But progress happens as we see that we're able to make other choices more often. Okay. Now, I might share some examples, but ultimately everybody's going to have different triggers, different traumas, and how that shows up and presents in their life. Okay. So I'm being fairly general here because there's a lot. I think one thing we can all agree on is this world has a lot of trauma in it. And we don't want to go out there and vomit that on other people because it just keeps it in cycle, right? Especially if it's our children. Little kids are sponges. So they're picking up on things sometimes that we're not even aware of, okay? However, they don't have the ability that we do to integrate that necessarily in a factual way because they still have magic thinking. They still have those brains that are open to anything being possible. So they might create, which is half of our problems, a belief system that isn't based in reality, that isn't based in logic necessarily, but more in whatever their perception is based on their personality, okay? Or the way their brain works, because everybody is different out here. So this is how sometimes these belief systems that we wouldn't necessarily agree with here exist in our brain and, through automatic pilot, impact a lot of the choices we make. So, perfect example. All right, I'm not going to go into how this was created, but if somebody has a worth issue, a self-worth issue, they don't feel they're good enough, or they don't, in whatever capacity, whether that's looks, whether that's finances, whether that's success, whether that's just as a human being, okay? Maybe they were beat down, maybe they just created this misconception with that magic thinking as a child and believed that they were unworthy because maybe mom and dad were super busy or not present as much as that particular child needed. Okay. This is why you can have siblings grow up in the same house and all have like different perceptions. Maybe not all, but usually this happens. Sometimes I talk to my brother and it's like, what house did you grow up in? Right? Because, depending on our personality, that aids with that filter into what belief systems we're creating. All right. And I know this may not make sense, but it's true. Okay. I've seen it play out so many times. So at the end of the day, based on those belief systems, if you have a self-worth issue or you don't think you're smart enough or pretty or handsome enough or just good enough for whatever reason, maybe you grew up with a lot of guilt, shaming, whatever the case may be, okay? When you get an opportunity that comes across your path, whether that be in a partnership, whether that be a fiscal or financial opportunity, whether that be an opportunity to broaden your horizons or put yourself out there, right? If you're on automatic pilot and you're allowing the belief system of I'm not good enough basically impact your choices, chances are you're not going to say yes when an opportunity comes across your path. You might come up with all kinds of reasons to justify the belief system, right? And that's if you're even aware that you're doing it. Our brain can run without us. right? And it's not always our friend, but it is always trying to keep us alive. But this is why we get a lot of irrational belief systems and fears, right? That wouldn't exist in nature. You know, I was watching a video, actually, a reel, and it was these military men they were jumping out of a plane, and they all had like canine dogs with them, and the dogs, no hesitation whatsoever. The dogs weren't freaked out. They weren't nothing. They're like, oh, I'll just jump out and fall for however high up they were. They looked pretty high up. Okay, just saying. I would have had a panic attack. Okay. Because well, I don't know how irrational it is, but I guess it is, because there are plenty of people that are willing to jump out of planes and love the exhilarating experience. Me, I'd probably pass out. So it's not for me, okay? I'm a safety girl. I'm a very low risk person, okay? So that's me. And you could potentially harm yourself by jumping out of an airplane, just saying, okay? However, I'd like to think that these people are professionals and know what they're doing. But to my point, animals don't tend to hold the same fears that we do because they're not necessarily overthinkers. They're more grounded just by nature, and they are more instinctual. We have those same abilities. We just don't always tap into them. And we have so many distractions in our world, our day-to-day world, that it's really hard to do that. And I'm going to do another video on grounding and practical ways of doing that. But that's a side note. This is why grounding is so important, okay? But in any case, animals just tend to be more in the moment. They're more present, okay? And they don't hold irrational fears. And they're very instinctual and action-oriented. So when something does happen, they're on it, right? They move quick. I had an example today. I'm going to put out a short of this cute little groundhog that was just out in my yard. And as soon as my dog started barking, that thing ran, and the dog was in the house. So they don't overthink. Let's put it that way. Animals don't overthink like humans do. And not every human overthinks either, but most of us have that ability. Let's put it that way. So with that being said, it's how our belief systems can impact us, okay? So as we start learning that by pausing, by actually sitting with the emotions and not running from them, you don't have to be afraid of them. You survived whatever it is that you fear in that sense when it comes to trauma, okay? However, if you really struggle with this piece of it, I urge you to work with someone, okay, that can help you, a professional, that can help you slow it down enough to do the work. Because this is where the forgiveness, the healing happens, okay? In this case, it might be forgiveness of self, because as you realize and start reframing or restructuring those belief systems by sitting with it in that pause, challenging it, right? And reminding yourself how safe you are now. And again, this is if we are safe, okay? A lot of this healing work we want to do when we're in a safe place, not when we're still in the middle of trauma, okay? If we're still living in a traumatic environment, first we need to remove ourselves from that in a safe way, right? Once we're removed from it and we can trust that we're in a safe environment, that's when we do trauma work, all right? But once we are in a safe environment, we can actually sit with that and do somatic, which is in the body work, where we link our emotions and how we're experiencing those in our body, which is more of a bottom-up approach. You think of deep breathing exercises, a lot of physical type mindfulness is somatic, right? Top down is when we do it more cerebrally or in a cerebral way, where it's our thoughts that we come at it from, okay? And then we start feeling that in our body as we're able to reframe. Ultimately, you're going to end up doing both at some point or another, okay? But it's important to be able to hold space with that. And depending on what we're healing, it may be very important to have somebody else present with you, okay? Typically a professional, so that they know how to bring you back and ground you, okay? That's important. But as we reframe those thoughts or those beliefs, as we look at them differently, and we can start seeing things differently, then we can hold compassion for ourselves and others. Keep in mind, forgiveness does not equal approval. We never have to approve of somebody's behaviors or even allow them access to our lives again, okay? Forgiveness is not that. Now, people will tell you all kinds of things, especially if they're the one that's going to benefit from it. But forgiveness is a letting go, where it's not holding toxicity in you anymore or holding power over you to be able to trigger you on a regular basis into an automatic behavior or thought process, okay? That holds you hostage, not only to behaviors that do not support you or help your life in a positive way, but also things that may re-traumatize you or just keep feeding the chaos, if you will, whatever that may be. Sometimes it's very violent, other times it's less, it's more toxic, but it keeps you in that energy, okay? So be mindful of that. That's what I mean by mindful. Be present, aware of it, right? And don't let it rule your life. Take back your power through the pause, right? Through actually looking at it with the brain you now have, okay? That's important because you do have more skills than oftentimes we give ourselves credit for. Sometimes we compartmentalize those skills and we don't generalize them to other areas of our lives. Perfect example of that is I know someone who's a great manager at work and has to deal with conflict resolution, things like that, but in their personal life, they don't like conflict. So their boundaries are a little different in their personal life. So when we talk, it's okay, well, how do we generalize the skill that you use at work to your home life? Then all of a sudden it's like we connect the dots and it's like, oh, wow, I didn't even think of that. Because that's how the brain works sometimes. Sometimes we overgeneralize the wrong things. Well, I don't want to say wrong because that's very judgy, but the things that don't necessarily help us, right? So if I have a fear at work or something happens to me at work and I bring that home, so it creates a toxic environment in my house, but that's not so much a skill. Right? It's not the skills that, skills we can overgeneralize because they're going to support us in any environment. It's the other stuff that we tend to overgeneralize when it's not beneficial for us. So just keep that in mind. So when we learn things and we get to new levels, sometimes we go down this spiral of shame, right? Like, God, if I only knew that then. And then, so forgiveness is also of self. All right. And this is where it's really important to remind yourself through the pause that you didn't know that then. We don't want to get ourselves stuck in the here and now because of regrets over the past, right? Sometimes maybe it helps if we ask for forgiveness or, I don't know, whatever it is that we need to do to atone for whatever happened. However, that's not always going to give us the results that we're looking for, okay? It may appease us, but we need to do it in such a way that we don't hold expectation over somebody else and their behaviors, because maybe the person we wronged isn't ready to forgive us, okay? Sometimes people are never ready to forgive. The hope is that they do, because they're only harming themselves by holding on to resentment and anger and all of those things, because emotions sit in our body and they do impact our health, especially if it's negative. Ultimately, if you're feeling good, let that generalize everywhere, right? But if we're not, we need to sit with that, and that's the need of healing. But healing usually comes with some level of forgiveness. Forgiveness of others, forgiveness of self. And we don't always need the other person in order to find closure, okay? Because again, it's those internal belief systems that actually have the power to keep us stuck or set us free. So with that in mind, it's more important, as within, so without, to deal with the reprogramming of our own mindset, the unknotting, if you will, of the negativity that we're holding on to with any particular belief system, okay? So as we do that, we will find that our nervous system typically will respond in such a way that eventually we may not even get triggered anymore, okay? But again, keep in mind, even if we're doing the healing work and we get triggered, that part does not indicate that you're not healing. What indicates your healing and the level of your healing is your response. If you're showing up differently, you're teaching your brain a different way. And this is why inspired action is so important, because your inspired action is how you show up after the trigger, okay? And other things too. When we're creative or really, in the moment, in the flow, we might get ideas that we can take inspired action on. But with regards to healing, the inspired action is I've sat with the pause, I've looked at what's going on, mind, body, spirit, mind being our thoughts and our beliefs, our spirit being our emotions and our essence, and our body encapsulates the two. So what happens to one impacts the other two always, okay? So when we're able to sit with that and take inspired action, that's not the same automatic behaviors or automatic thinking that we have engaged in the past. That's progress. Own that. We don't want to just own the things that we're working on and trying to change. That's just more shaming, right? Yes, we want self-accountability. We want to be able to say, this isn't working for me. It's not working for those around me, but I'm only as good for them as I am for myself first. So I have to start on me, okay? Self-accountability. And as you reframe yourself, you change the way you think. Not everything, okay? Not everything, because you're not doing everything wrong here, all right? You're doing a lot of things right. Own those things too. Let those things encourage you as you move forward and remind you that you're not a terrible human being. Nobody is that bad, okay? Yes, there are people out here doing really bad things, okay? Hopefully they become self-accountable and start working on themselves. Because the more people that do this kind of work and heal, the less vomiting of emotions, projections, and negative energy we have going on out here. And the happier we can all be. Because again, we're going to show up differently for other people when we first show up differently for ourselves. Okay? So forgiveness of self is going to be key, because not everything you're going to feel that you have to forgive yourself for is something that really requires forgiving. but it's going to feel like it because we're going to have shame around, I can't believe I behaved that way, or that I believed that maybe you were lied to and you treated somebody in a particular way who didn't deserve it. Okay, whatever. There's so many different offenses out here that we can look at. However, at the end of the day, the best thing you can do for yourself and that other person is work on you and let things go. And sometimes, like, if you feel you owe someone an apology, you bring an apology to them. My hope for you is that they forgive you. But if they're not in a place to, we don't want to re-traumatize them either. So read the room. And if they're not in a place where they can forgive you, say your apology and leave them alone. Be mindful of your expectations. That's control. If I can only forgive myself if this other person forgives me, that's keeping yourself stuck. Because that other person may either not be ready or they may be gone. I've had to forgive people after they've passed away. You know, because at the end of the day, I'm in control of my belief systems. I'm in control of how I look at things. It doesn't feel that way until you do the work and practice and keep doing the work. And then eventually it becomes second nature. Just as those maladaptive behaviors became second nature. Okay. So hopefully that helps. All right. I'm going to let you go. Have a good one, and I'll be back soon. All right. Bye.